Okay, good evening. Thank you for the invitation this evening. Both Cousin Bill and I used to be school teachers, and so we'll probably both be able to speak by projecting our voice. But if you can't hear us, raise your hand or doze off or something, then we'll know we're not reaching. And I don't, Bill can act as he will, but I'll stand to talk because I always get nervous when I'm sitting and talking. I present too easy of a target. I kind of like to bob and weave when I talk. So the Kehmeier family sends its regards to the Cedar Edge Historical Society. We certainly have a relationship with this society. My dad is a lifetime member. Cousin Bill will speak for himself, but his dad was, maybe you knew his dad, some of you. He's very involved in working at part-time at the Historical Society here. And Bill, you were quite involved for quite a number of years, weren't you?
For a while. I was on the board for a while.
So Bill and I are going to tag team tonight, and we might interrupt each other to clarify the other's points if they're drifting off from the truth, and it could be that we'll get started telling stories and both need to add in our embellishments. But we're pleased to be with you this evening. My father and Bill's father Jack are members of 14 cousins who are the grandchildren of Will and Leota Kehmeier, who were the first Kehmeiers in this area. 14 of them, of the cousins, and all are gone now but 3. The 3 that are still here are in their 90s, and one of them is my father. He sends his regards to you this evening, but chose to stay home because of the coronavirus. He very much wanted to come to make sure he could keep Cousin Bill and me lined out, but
That's a full-time job sometimes.
but Cousin Bill and I, the time is almost here where it's our generation who are the seniors of the family, so it's fitting that we take over. My father is in a few months will be 95 years old. He's still in good shape mentally. His mind is sharp, and he still does quite a bit of the tractor work on our farm, and can still back a tractor up. When you're hooking up a tractor to an implement, an inch one way or the other matters of whether or not you're going to be able to drop that pin in. And many's the time when I'm working with him and I'm helping him hook up to another piece of equipment, he'll back up the tractor and he's kind of got to turn and get all numbered up so he can look over his shoulder, and then he'll back that up and I'll take that pin and it'll just go clink right into the implement. So if Cousin Bill and I are in as good a shape as my dad, when we're 95 years, we'll be thankful. I call him Cousin Bill because I think the whole valley knows him as Cousin Bill. So
If you've been around Paul at any time, and I've been there, it's Cousin Bill.
yeah. So there are 3 left of the generation now, and my dad wrote a book. He's a pretty good writer, and Cousin Bill and I may be both reading from it tonight and at least referring to it as a reference. You will perhaps forgive me if when I read from it, if I get a little choked up, because these aren't just words on the page. I can see my grandfather, I can see my father, I can see the house, I can see the logs, I can see the mountain, I can see the irrigation water. So we're pleased to speak with you, and Bill's gonna take over now, and when he gets done, I'll back clean up. So.
Thank you, Paul. As Paul said, thank you to the Service Creek Historical Society for inviting us so that we can share a little bit about our family, about the history of our family in this area. Our great-grandfather and great-grandmother moved here in 1894. They were living in Canyon City, Salida area, and when they came over Monarch Pass, they came over in a covered wagon. You know, they didn't have these nice little automobiles that we can over quick. And it was several days it took them to get here. And that was in 1894. And one of the reasons that they chose the Surface Creek Valley was that our great-grandmother's brother, a gentleman by the name of Charles Hale, had moved here with his family and had homesteaded a place up on Cedar Mesa. Don't ask me where it is because I don't know. I have never been able to find out where it's at. Paul knows.
I forgot to tell where our farm is. Maybe I'll mention it.
I will. But in 1894, William Frederick Kehmeier and Lena Leota Kehmeier moved to the Eckerd area, a half-mile west of Eckerd, and purchased 65 acres from Charles States. With them, they had 3 children. One that was 4, one that was 2, and one that was less than a year old. They moved into a log house that was there. The log house is still there, right behind my house. There's a small log house, and that was the house that was originally here in 1894. Before my dad passed away, he asked if he would be willing to pay the part of remodeling it and restoring it. So he paid for that, and we now have the original log cabin sitting there. It's about a 10-foot by 20-foot cabin. It had a loft in it. 5 people were living in it. 3 small children and my great-grandparents. Well, about a year after they moved here, actually about almost 2 years after they moved here, my grandfather was born, so they now had 4 children. And in 2 more years, they had another child, a girl. And then 2 more years, they had another girl. And 2 more years, they had another girl. But in 1897, they decided that little log cabin was much too small for them because they knew that they were going to be having another child at that time. And so they built a much larger wood structure. It has squared logs on it. And it also is sitting on our property at this time. It is being used as a storage shed. I keep my 4-wheelers and stuff like that in it. A great facility, but it is one of the cabins that they built. And then in 1907, they decided, you know, we've got all these kids, we don't have enough room in this. So they moved that cabin from where it was sitting, which is where my house now sits. They moved it and they built my house. My house is 2 stories. It has 8-inch poured concrete walls for 2 stories. When we were getting ready to remodel it in 1998, we had an engineer go through and look at it, and he could not believe how square that house was. And he had troubles believing that it was actually 2 stories of poured concrete. But as we were doing some of the remodeling, we saw that there were places in the wall that they had rocks that were this big around. So it's poured concrete with a lot of rocks in it, I'm sure. But that house is still standing today. It's the house that my wife Cindy and I live in. And one of the reasons that we wanted to restore it was because of the historical meaning for it for us. And so we have added a little bit to it, and since in 2012 we added a larger family room so that we could get our kids and grandkids all together in it. Okay? Well, in 1994, when William and Leota moved here, as I say, they had 3 kids. Our grandfather was born in Delta County. Okay? And I'm glad that my son and his family are here, because my grandson and my granddaughter are 5th generation of Delta County born residents. 5th generation. Very few families in Delta County can claim that. I think there's one that may have a 6th generation, okay? But to me, that's very special. It means that there's something about this community, something about this area that is special, not only to us, but to other people that have been here for a long time. Jerry said that he wanted a little bit about water tonight, I think. One of the interesting things about our house, when it was built, the house that we presently are living in, and when it was built, the only running water that they had was, they were able to bring in, was from the ditch out front. And so, alongside the northwest corner of the house, there is a little concrete structure about that long, about that wide, and I don't know how deep because I haven't chosen to dig it out to see. But they ran the ditch water from the Orchard Ranch ditch, which ran in front of their house. They ran ditch water down into that. They had it filled with charcoal, and that charcoal then filtered the ditch water, and then it went from there into a cistern that they had built on the back porch. The cistern has not been used any time that I recall, that's 67 years. I do not recall it ever being used. I don't recall ever seeing it, except for a little bit of the indentation where the lid was. But that's how they got water into the house. Okay, and so as they used that water then, they would dip it out of the cistern, take it in, use it for however they needed to use it. And I thought that was a very unique thing to have, is that charcoal pit, to be able to run their water into that. And I get all this information from my dad, okay, Jack. Jerry, I think, had him in school. Bob and Roxy had him in school. There's several of you here that had Dad in school. He was a history buff. He loved history. And so he would tell us all of these things that were happening and what happened with the Kehmeier family. Okay? Well, after William and Leota moved here in 1894, they had to figure out how, and they bought 65 acres. There's 65 acres. We currently own 5 of it. Another gentleman owns 1 of it. And Paul and his family own
The rest.
the rest. 59 acres of it. Okay? It's really neat to be able to think about the fact that the family owns it. Well, William and Leota decided that the only way that they were going to make a living was doing the farming. Well, at this point in time, the Surface Creek Mesa area was starting to be known as a fruit growing area. And so William purchased $115 worth of fruit trees, which for back then was an extremely large amount. He actually gave a warranty deed to a Utah nursery, and within, I'm thinking, 4 years, they had it paid off. okay? Most of it was apples. They did have peaches, okay? I don't think there was any cherries or any other fruit. I think it was all apples and peaches. There's a picture of that we have of surrounding my house that is nothing but orchard, directly alongside my house and all around it. So that's how he started making his money. And it was only on about that 5 acres that we currently live on is where that orchard was. The rest of it was wheat, alfalfa, row crops. The only problem with this land at that time is to plow it up. You could plow it up, but then you had to go pick up the rocks that were this big around. And
It's still a problem after 120 years.
And you will see rock walls to the west of my house. You will see rock walls clear to the south property line. And those rock walls are all there and made from the rocks that were taken off of the Kehmeier land. In 1999, Kehmeier Ranch was recognized by the Colorado Historical Society for being a Centennial farm. A Centennial farm is a farm that has been in the same family for at least 100 years. There are a lot more Centennial farms in Delta County than you would realize. And one of them, many of you know the Vellas. Their farm actually started in 1893. So the Vellas and the Kehmeiers have been an integral part of that area down there since 1893, 1894. And I'll let Paul explain a little bit about some of the construction, I don't know what else he's going to talk about, but go for it.
I'm working on an agenda as we speak. My great-grandfather and Bill's great-grandfather did not homestead here. As Bill mentioned, they bought the property from someone who owned it previously. It turns out, little known to us of this generation, that there was a type of person, a business of people would come into the area and homestead a piece of ground and do what was necessary under the homestead laws. It's called proving it up, build a dwelling and do some improvements on the land. And once they received a deed to that property, they would sell it. So in this days and age, people buy houses and fix them up and sell them. In other words, they flip houses. Well, it turns out 125 years ago, people were flipping homesteads. And so our great-grandfather bought from a person who had proved it up. The goal and ideal of any decent farmer or rancher in this area is they only have one goal, and that is to buy out their neighbors. So over the years, we have indeed done that. The property has expanded and sometimes contracted with the passing of a generation. There is sometimes a contraction as an estate is settled, but presently the Kehmeier farm is a little bit less than 300 acres. It extends from cousin Bill and Cindy's house about a half-mile west of Eckerd on the south side of the road. Then it extends westward down into the Tongue Creek Valley. We own some property in the Tongue Creek Valley. So I wish to start off my reading this evening with a short reading that my dad wrote about irrigating. Irrigating has changed a lot over the years, but it's still quite an art and also quite a bit of work. So I'll pick up here in a short reading from my father, This is him talking and his experiences. He says, irrigating is hard work. It requires judgment, care, and attention to get the seeds wet and not waste the water. Things go wrong. Flow volumes in the head ditches vary, or trash floats and collects and forms miniature dams. Intricate adjustments are ruined. Go to bed at dark so you can get up with the first faint light in the east. Something might have happened during the night to change the delicate settings. Crawl out of bed in the dark before dawn, pull on your boots and grab a shovel. Out in the field, there's just enough light to see the head ditch. Maybe you should have brought a flashlight. April morning is cold, cold. The water, when you dip your bare hands in it to remove a trash dam, is liquid ice. I want to make an editorial comment here. So I came back about 10 years ago to help out my folks, and the first thing I did is I bought my dad and me a pair of rubber gloves, because I just wasn't feeling this ice cold water in the spring. So that's an improvement I made in my generation. The water is liquid ice. You think of the warm bed you recently quitted. You feel pretty sorry for yourself. Cry, baby, cry, baby. 2 killdeer run ahead of you, your stumbling steps, and taunt you with their shrill call. Their criticism of your attitude calls you to shame. They are obviously completely satisfied with the life and with the environment. Their project for the day, as soon as you get out of their feathers, is to select the shallow depression that will become a nest for 2 gray speckled eggs. As the eggs hatch, soon they'll turn into 2 tiny gray-barred fluff balls, running quickly across the clods on toothpick stilts. Cry, baby, cry, baby. The dawn light in your frame of mind gradually improves. The sun reveals what was accomplished overnight and what is still left to be done. Cement ditches, gated pipe, and mechanical trash cleaners have made irrigation life easier, but there's still a lot of artistry involved. One of my earliest memories is my grandfather, John, and of course, I should say our grandfather. Any grandfather I have, Cousin Bill has.
No, really, because on the Kehmeier side,
Stopping by the house and to pick me up, to take me to irrigate, and he taught me the art of irrigating, and many's the time I've followed him around the farm irrigating. He was a master at the art. We had a longtime neighbor to our south, the Fippany family. They came in at about the same time our family did, and you know, you look for any water you can to keep your crops wet. And one of the things you do is you use the water that runs off the fields from your neighbors upstream, above you. We call it wastewater, but I think the more appropriate term is tailwater, because it certainly doesn't go to waste if we can keep it from going to waste. Anyway, Bruce Fippany used to complain about my grandfather John. He said, you know, John doesn't even let enough water off of that place of his to fill a teacup. So he didn't help out the Fippnys very much when it came to irrigation water. Well, Bill mentioned the main homesteads, and there's one other house still on the Kehmeier farm, although as Bill mentioned, it's been sold and owned by another individual. It was built by our grandfather John and his wife Gertrude. And I have a little bit of an extended reading here to talk about how Granddad John got the trees, got the logs to build the house. It's about a 15-minute reading, but I think I can do no better than my father's words when it comes to telling the history of the Kehmeiers. So here we go. John and Gertrude decided the only solution for housing for their growing family was to build. The new house was to be built of spruce logs that John would cut and haul from Grand Mesa. In the fall of 1933, he made an appointment with a forest ranger to mark the trees. They met on Grand Mesa and walked a timbered hillside on the upper reaches of Ward Creek, picking out 50 tall, straight spruce trees that would be logs for the house. Once they were marked, he and his eldest son, Jack, Bill's dad, spent some days cutting and trimming them, using not chainsaws but double-bitted axes. With a team of horses, they snaked the logs to a temporary loading dock they contrived on the slope on the upper side of a crude wagon track. There, the logs lay for a year, drying and curing into top-quality house logs. The next fall, they were hauled home 20 miles with a team of horses and a wagon, up one day, back the next for several heavy, awkward loads. My granddad rose before daylight on a late August morning. While his breakfast was being ready, he fed the team and harnessed them. After he had eaten, he hitched them to the wagon and that he had loaded the day before. Actually, it was nothing but a set of running gears. Those are wheels. 4 wheels short coupled together with a place for him to sit, and an apple box which held the log chains, rope, camp gear, and oats for the horses. He pulled out of the yard and headed up the road as the sun peeked over the eastern horizon, and a meadowlark on the top of a fence post trilled a turf warning at him and his team. 20 miles uphill, 7 hours, including a lunch break and a chance for the team to rest. He urged the team into a trot to get them warmed up, but soon allowed them to settle into a steady walk. They were too big for trotters. The sun rose and warmed his back, and he dozed, letting the horses have their head. At first Kaiser Creek crossing, he drove into the middle of the stream and stopped the team so they could drink. He moved upstream of them and lay down on the bank and had a drink himself. He reviewed his progress, maybe a little over halfway, the easy half. He ate a sandwich and a ripe peach while the team had a bait of oats and stood hip-shot dozing in the sun. The next 4 hours were a steady climb through the scrub oaks and aspen, up the steep graveled auto road with its innumerable switchbacks. He studied the narrow passage through the aspen forest as he climbed, occasionally letting the team stop to blow. This would be tomorrow's severest test. In mid-afternoon, he topped the ridge above Ward Creek where the logs lay stockpiled. He looked them over for signs of damage and decided they had not been bothered. He immediately went to work because he knew now he was working against tomorrow's clock and that there was a lot to be done before he would have his first load of logs parked at home in the valley. He positioned the running gear along the side of the log pile with the rear wheels about 2/3 of the way back of the heavy butt ends of the 36-foot logs. Next, he uncoupled the front axle from the rear and drove the team ahead until the front wheels were about 3 feet short of the other end. He then unhitched and unharnessed the team and picketed one of them in the middle of a thick stand of grass. He turned the others loose, free to graze. He stood looking over the setup, whistling tunelessly through his teeth and muttering action plans to himself, as he often did when he was working alone. First, he took a double-bit axe and cut a couple of stout spruce poles, 8 inches in diameter and 10 or 12 feet long. These he laid with one end jammed under the downhill side of the log bunker and the other end resting at one each on front of the running gear. Taking up a log peavey that he had borrowed from a neighbor, he carefully eased a log out of the pile and rolled it across the spruce log's sticks until it dropped with a thud onto the spaced out running gear. He stood back and looked with a small feeling of pride at the beginning of the load, judging the placement of the axles and the probable distribution of the weight when the load would be completed. No way to tell, really. He would just have to take a chance. He worried 2 more logs onto the wagon and stopped to look again. He planned to haul 8 logs in each load. A lot of weight, but that divided the total nicely into 7 loads. The 3 loaded logs nearly filled the empty space between the standards of the running gear. So he cut and trimmed some short stays and fit them into stake loops on the outside standards. He's making sides for his wagon. He loaded 3 more logs for a second layer and drove stakes into stake loops on the near side. Again, he stopped for a short break to consider his progress. The sun dropped behind the trees on the hill at his back. It sent a chill up his spine, not because of the temperature, but because of the hour and the schedule he had to meet in order to get home tomorrow. He realigned the skid sticks on top of the loaded logs and worked 2 more logs onto the load. This turned out to be hard to do because now he had to roll up the incline. By working on alternate ends and blocking behind, he finally managed to work the 8th log onto the load. It was almost dark now, and he wanted to watch the slender moon in the western sky as he shivered from the mountain cold and the sweat drying on his damp shirt. He had hoped to have the load chained and ready to go, but that would have to wait until daylight. He built a small fire and made coffee, ate some bread and cold roast pork that he had in his grub box. Before he replenished the fire, he led the picketed horse to a nearby small stream for a drink. He then set the picket in a new spot while he visited with his horses, rubbing their necks and swearing at them in a friendly, quiet voice. As the last light of day vanished in the west, he wrapped himself in a couple of blankets, inflated his inflatable mattress, turned on his radio, just kidding. Wrapped himself in a couple of blankets and dropped off into a restless sleep while the easy night wind breezed softly in the spruce forest. He wakened at the first light of the new day that it appeared in the east. Rolling stiffly from his blankets, he built up the fire and made new coffee. Breakfast was a can of baked beans warmed in the glowing coals, some bread, and another ripe peach. He watered the picketed horse again and walked over to the loaded wagon. Loaded, but not secured. There were 2 heavy log chains. He threw one around the load at each axle of the running gear and hooked it with enough slack to insert a stout stick into the loop of the chain. He then tightened the chains by twisting the loop on top of the load. Next, he threaded a length of rope through a small pulley on the top of the lever that engaged the rear brakes on the rear wheels. He tied one end of the rope at the front of the load and fixed a loop for his right foot on the other end. With this arrangement, he could apply pressure on the wagon's brake shoes with a 2-to-1 mechanical advantage. There was one more small preparation that was necessary. The first 100 yards or so of the road was a steep pitch down to the wagon road. He took a piece of stout rope and tied it to the spoke at the bottom of one wheel. Then the other end of the rope he tied forward to the front log chain. Thus, he had installed a rough lock on one wheel. It was an old trick known to every wagon freighter of bygone days. It was called, as you might guess, a rough lock. Ready. He harnessed and hitched the well-rested team. He collected his tools and his camp gear and climbed up to the front of the load. Placing his foot into the loop on the brake rope, he gathered his reins and spoke to the team. They eased onto the slope and strained a little to pull against the locked wheel. No problem for them, though. The pitch was steep enough that the skidding wheel was not enough to hold back the load, and a combination of pressure on the brake and the holdback available to the team with the bridging of their harnesses was barely enough to control the descent of the loaded wagon to a more manageable grade. Once there, he allowed himself a little sigh of relief as he dismounted and removed the rough lock. The sun was well up, and the road home was 20 miles long as the journey got underway. Soon he was in the aspen belt and negotiating the steep road and switchbacks. He found to his relief that he could maintain control with the rear wheel brakes and the holdback ability of the team of horses. As team and driver became acquainted with the load and the road, they relaxed somewhat and began to feel more optimistic about the day. However, trouble was, in a manner of speaking, just right around the corner. As he approached one particularly sharp switchback, he kept the team to the extreme inside curve and eased them across the road, almost into the trees on the other side before starting the turn. As the team on the front end came around, however, the rear axles became a fulcrum and swung the 12 feet of the extended load into the thick stand of trees on the outside of the turn. There he was stuck, with the rear end of the load into the trees on the left side, and any further attempt of bringing the team around on the right and on down the road, only forcing the load further into the thick aspen trees at the rear. Well, there was a solution, but it was time-consuming and it wasn't easy. He pulled the queen bolt that attached the double tree to the tongue, thus unhitching from the load. He moved the team around to the right side of the wagon. With a short length of chain, he hooked to the bottom of the inside wheel and very carefully skidded the wagon sideways until it was pointed down the road instead of into the trees. When he again hooked up the team to the wagon, he had the room to pull straight ahead until the rear sweep of load cleared the stand of aspen, and thus he was on his way again. Once wasn't too bad, but 4 times he was forced into this maneuver before he was out of the steep switchbacks and finally on some relatively open road. The day was evaporating and he and the horses were tired. So he stopped for a sparse lunch for himself and water and a feeding of oats for the horses. 15 more miles. 5 hours, but fairly easy travel if nothing broke down. All downhill, and mostly all he had to do was enough braking to keep the load from overrunning the team. They were as anxious as he was to get home, though, so they pointed their ears forward and set off for home at a mile-eating clip. It was full dark when he pulled into the yard. He put the team away and quietly entered the house to the welcome of his relieved wife and excited kids. Here's the postscript. Slim Watson was at the time a new friend and helpful neighbor. He came over the next day to see the load of logs in the yard. How come you went off by yourself to do that? Didn't you know I wanted to go? Besides, what if those logs had rolled on top of you? Those horses might have starved to death tied up to a tree pinned under the load. Next time we'll both go and break 2 loads down at once. So that ends my reading, and I see by Cousin Bill's body language he has some comments, and I'll come back for a short ending comments when Cousin Bill is finished.
At the time that Granddad was doing this, as Paul said, the first trip he made by himself. The subsequent trips he made with Slim Watson and my dad went. Dad was 11 years old. But from what I understand from Dad, Granddad trusted him completely by being able to handle those horses coming down. Didn't let him handle the braking system. Didn't let him handle the horses. And since they went up with Slim, they took 2 teams up and 2 wagons, and as they were coming down and they get to that sharp turn, they would just stop, unhook one of that back team, hook in, pull it sideways, get them down, hook the team back up, then bring the other team back up to slip the backside of the second wagon down. And so it was a very time-consuming, very labor-intensive way to do it. But that house got built. Paul and I got to spend a lot of hours in our youth inside that house, remembering the times that our grandmother would be working in the kitchen and she would make a cake, or she would be making cookies or something. And just being able to spend that time with them was amazing. Those are some of the things that you guys have those kind of memories too. But it was really fun for us to be able to spend that time. As Paul said, Dad got to help with trimming and doing some of the stuff on the trees. There's an 11-year-old kid that is using a axe that's real sharp on both sides. So Dad, kids back then grew up a lot faster as far as their work ethic, as far as learning what it took to be an effective worker. And one of the things that I appreciate from my dad, and I know that Paul appreciates it from his dad, is they taught us that work ethic. They taught us that things are not easy all the time. Sometimes you have to work really, really hard to accomplish it. But once you accomplish it, it is a job well done. And so, that house, that log house that is 200 yards to the west of me, is the house that Paul just read about the logs being hauled down. So, were you next?
So here are my closing philosophical comments. I am the farmer of the family now. It's Bill and me, our generation now, on the farm. I do most of the farming, but if there's any really hard stuff to do, I call Bill to come over and help me. And I want to leave the Kehmeier farm in better condition than I found it. It was already in quite good condition, so that's a tall order. Normally in my generation, or normally the new generation acquires more land, but that's not very practical anymore in our area because of a variety of features. So I am working diligently to upgrade the irrigation system on the property. We, as Bill indicates, we respect our heritage a lot in our family, and I'm sure you in your family do too. Bill and Cindy have a sign out front of their house that shows it's designated as a Centennial farm. A number of years ago, my parents did a conservation easement on our entire property. You're probably familiar with conservation easements, but simply it means that they deeded away their right to ever put houses on the land. It'll be agricultural land or open space forever, or at least until hell freezes over. I don't know which will come first. The weight of passing the farm on to the next generation weighs on my shoulders, and I don't know what is going to happen. I've got a niece and a nephew over here, and a whole bunch of other nieces and nephews who may someday be renting the Kehmeier farm.
They're actually cousins, but you can call them nieces and nephews.
I don't even try to deal with it. Everyone's cousin or everyone's niece or nephew, that's how it works. But you know, I've been reflecting recently on our great grandparents. You know, here in the Historical Society and on our farm, we're about preserving the history and the legacy. And that's good, that's good. But it has come to me to, I've realized that the defining characteristic of actually of the people who started the Kehmeier line here in the valley is they were risk takers, they were movers, they left what was safe and comfortable to go and start in a new place. So I have chosen to remember that characteristic of my heritage also, not just the preserving of the old ways, but the preserving of the willingness to take risk, to try new things, to go into a new land that they didn't know, and take the risk to try to make it. So I think that's, for me, a nice combination of both the legacy of preservation and the legacy of moving out to the new territory. So I now defer to my elder cousin to close this out, and at the leave of Jerry, we will take questions if you have any we'd like to ask.
So just in closing our part of the presentation, if you wonder where the Kehmeier Ranch is, or where the Kehmeier property is, you go to Eckert, you turn right, turn west on North Road, you go exactly 1/2 mile, and my property line is right there, and there's a diagonal fence along the property. And an interesting part of it, the diagonal had nothing to do with anything other than that's the direction that the irrigation rows ran. So that's how they put the fence in, okay? But my house, large tan 2-story stucco house, and from there to Running Deer on the south side is the Kehmeier, the original Kehmeier 65 acres. So anytime you want to drive by, you know where it is. As you drive by my house, if you want to look to the back, you can see the small cabin and the other cabin that is larger there. And those are the ones that were originally there. Those also are recognized by the State Historical Society as being historical structures. Since we're a Centennial farm, we had those two also recognized as historical structures. So I would like to thank Jerry and the Historical Society for inviting Paul and I to come here tonight. You never want to get an educator talking because they don't know when to stop and when to shut up. Okay, but it's getting close to an hour that we've been going. I want to thank you so much, all of you, for coming and listening to us. We are very proud members of the Kehmeier family. We're very proud members of the Surface Creek community. And we are hoping that, what we do down there and what we have done down there can bring a little bit of joy to this area. So,
Questions?
Anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. How many horses were on the team?
2.
No way.
Yeah. Can't remember the second one's name. One of them's name was Bosco. That's all I can remember. And Dad used to tell me that there were two horses, and they were draft horses. They were big, heavy horses. And that's part of the reason Granddad had to use the braking system for that. But yes, ma'am.
Can you describe the braking system? How does that?
No. Paul may be able to.
I can't very well. I'm about 80 years too young. But on a bicycle, there's brake shoes that clamp against the sides of the bike. Well, that's basic idea, I think these brake shoes probably fit on top. Is that right, Bob?
I don't know.
But anyway,
You're older than we are, so we thought we'd ask.
it's basically a shoe like bicycle brake that fits down on top of the steel rim of the wheel and causes friction and helps slow them down. It certainly is not as good a brakes as we have
And
now.
the more pressure that you were able to apply was the more braking you would have.
Do you still have any orchard trees?
No.
No.
We've tried a lot of things over the years. We're in the practice of farming, and we're still practicing at it. But mostly now we raise hay and grain, and we sell it for cattle feed.
In my 5 acres, I raise cows and pigs, chickens, and we just for ourselves, you know. But
Your reservoir on Grand Mesa, is that your grandfather or great-grandfather?
our great grandfather, my understanding is there was probably some type of a reservoir that was already there when he bought the land, but he needed more water, and so he also was able to I don't know if the reservoir came with it, but he went in and raised it some. And then in 1948, my dad, Paul's dad, our grandfather, and our other uncle Gordon, they went up and raised the reservoir some more. It was at 150 acre feet, and they raised it so that it now holds 300 acre feet.
Which reservoir is that?
It's the Kehmeier Reservoir.
Oh,
It's back, if you are familiar with Grand Mesa, as you go back towards Weir and Johnson, just before you get to Weir and Johnson and climb up there, there's a reservoir down on the south side. That's the Kehmeier Reservoir there.
Most of the reservoirs on Grand Mesa are now owned by reservoir companies or groups of individuals. There are a few reservoirs that are still family held. Ours is one of them. Nearby is the Vela Reservoir, who are our neighbors down at Everett.
But one thing about the reservoir, when they started doing that, when they started building the reservoir, they would have 1 or 2 horses that would be hooked to a scrape, and it would be a slip scrape, and basically it looks, you know, like a big wheelbarrow that's kind of turned on its side, and they would have the horse pull that across, they would tip it up, and then they would take it to the reservoir, to the dam, and then they would dump it. And then they would have the horses go back. There's a story, and I don't know how true this is,
It's true.
but there's a story that my great grandfather, when they